The Roman Empire was the largest in the ancient world. Its capital was Rome, and its empire was based in the Mediterranean area. Capital punishment, the legally authorized killing of someone as punishment for a crime, was a culture in the Roman Empire. Unfortunately for the human race, the history of capital punishment has been a long, bloody, and humiliating one. Most of us today are lucky enough to live in countries where the death penalty has been abolished. But generally, this has only happened in the last half-century, and there are still many parts of the world where some crimes are punishable by death. Capital punishment has been recorded as having been practiced since ancient times, and regrettably, we have been all too creative in thinking up different methods of inflicting pain, humiliation, and death on our fellow human beings. In one ancient society, that of ancient Rome, capital punishment was seen as a way of maintaining the status quo and deterring any would-be criminals from future disobedience. Ancient Rome was both a very hierarchical and patriarchal society. Roman citizens were at the top of the heap, and then there were the battalions of slaves who did all the hard work and kept the households, businesses, and farms running. If you were lucky enough to have been born a Roman citizen, then you were also more fortunate if you were born male. The man of the house was the pater familias, and he was entitled to rule this family with an iron rod if he chose, as his authority was absolute. The Roman Empire is known for its inhumane and insane punishment inflicted on people. The general rule in the Roman Empire was that slaves could be freely tortured. It was highly recommended that any free man accused of a crime would have his slaves tortured in his place, often to the death, so that a verdict could be reached. Crucifixion. One of the insane and inhumane punishments in the Roman Empire is crucifixion. Ancient Romans loved a good crucifixion. It was at one time the primary method used to torture and kill countless numbers of slaves. Roman law used this torture not only to kill, but also to dishonor and emphasize the low status of the convict. Crucifixion did not always involve nailing the accused to a cross. Sometimes the accused was stripped, his head was covered, and he was tied down onto a cross or fork. He was then flogged, sometimes until he died. If the accused was not supposed to die by continuous flogging, the next course of action involved nailing his hands to the cross beam. He was then hoisted onto a planted post, and his feet were nailed to the post. He might be left there to die a slow death, or his thighs might be broken to help speed his end. In some cases, the accused might be hung upside down on the post. Other times, the executioner had the post driven through the accused's private parts. The methods used differed from executioner to executioner, with no one set method of crucifixion for all. Crucifixion itself without significant damage to organs does not cause death. In most cases, the direct cause of death of the convict, which occurs within a few to several hours or even days, was suffocation, exhaustion, dehydration, or bleeding as a result of injuries. In this case, the convict initially had legs quite straight, bent enough that the feet could be nailed to the cross. After a few to a dozen or so hours, the leg muscles could no longer support the weight and bent under the convict. Then the diaphragm was oppressed so much that the convict began to choke, and it could last several hours. Another way to die on the cross was to bleed out. Nails were driven in a way that led to faster death, or death from exhaustion, using a leg rest. Sewn into a donkey. If you are looking for cruel and unusual forms of torture, you do not have to look any further than ancient Rome. They were really cruel. Imagine the torture of being sewn into an animal. A donkey would be killed, its belly sliced open, and the entrails removed. The accused was then stripped of clothing and stuffed into the animal's belly. The belly was stitched closed, leaving only the accused's head outside, preventing suffocation but prolonging suffering. The donkey's body was kept in the sun. It would begin to decompose with the living victim inside being cooked by the heat. Maggots would crawl all over the accused, and vultures would peck at the animal's decaying flesh. Death, while welcomed, came slowly for the victim of this torture. The punican. Punican is a form of execution in the ancient Roman Empire consisting of being sewn up in a sack and sometimes with live animals such as snakes, dogs, monkeys, and cockerels, and then being thrown into the water. This is the punishment given to children who murder their parents or grandparents. All of the animals in the sack have their meaning and significance. Each of these animals had a symbolic meaning in ancient Rome that they connected to what they regarded as the monstrous crime of killing your father or close blood relation. The snake put in the sack was generally a viper, a reptile that was both feared and reviled in ancient Rome, as they give birth to live young, during which the young snakes could kill their mother. Dogs did not enjoy the same levels of affection as we give them today and were pretty much regarded as despised animals, the lowest of the low. If you were an ancient Roman, one of the worst insults that you could hurl at somebody would have been less than a dog. A monkey was seen as a lesser, inferior version of a human being, and cockerels were thought to have no family feelings at all. You would not be subjected to this unusual form of capital punishment if you were a grandfather who killed his grandsons or a mother who killed her children, as there were different sentences for those crimes. And if you were a father who murdered his children, then you probably would not get punished at all. After the accused is tied up with animals in a sack, then the whole bag was tossed into a body of water. If the animals didn't kill the alleged murderer, drowning surely would. Scaphism. Scaphism was one of the worst and most painful skin-crawling modes of torture. In this form of execution, the accused was trapped between two boats or in a hollowed-out tree trunk. The body of the accused is taken to a body of water and placed inside a boat. Another identical boat was then sealed on top of it to make a sort of shell, with the man's arms, legs, and head sticking out of the sides. He would then be force-fed honey and milk, covering his face and arms, and legs with it too. After a time in the direct sun, his face and limbs would become completely covered with flies. But the milk and honey diet eventually caused horrible diarrhea, which stayed within the wooden enclosure. The unfortunate condemned was smeared with more milk and honey and left out in the sun or near still water, where bugs would be attracted to the muck and rot and sweetness. Suffering diarrhea in the boat, vermin would feed on the excrement and then also start to enter the man's body and feed on that and devour him inside and out. The person would inevitably die, either of dehydration, exposure, or bite and sting wounds. Fed to wild dogs. This is a heinous torture that was performed on young women by the people of Heliopolis while under Roman rule. Any virgin who was to undergo this torture was first given to the gladiators. After the young woman was no longer a virgin, she was publicly stripped, and her belly was sliced open, spilling her entrails out. Then handfuls of barley were stuffed into her, and she was sewn back up. She will then be given to wild hogs that will tear her apart. Castration. In the Roman Empire, the higher your status, the more people you were allowed to bone without consequence. For example, the emperor would get it on with anyone he wanted. A general could make a move on a lieutenant or a common citizen, and soldiers could go after common citizens. Climbing up the social ladder was forbidden. If a common citizen decided to penetrate an unwilling soldier, the punishment was public castration. If the soldier willingly allowed the common citizen to penetrate him, he would be publicly disemboweled. These rules, coupled with true love between men, really muddied up the waters. It was easy for anyone to accuse a man of breaking rank or willingly giving in to penetration by a man of lesser status. Basket. One bizarre form of torture involved stripping a person down and stuffing him into a large, loosely woven basket. The basket was then hoisted up into a tree containing a large, active beehive. The bees were quickly angered, and the person inside the basket was then stung to death. The accused was meant to suffer in agony for as long as possible. However, there were cases where the victim of this torture died relatively quickly due to being allergic to bee stings. Crushing. Rome at some point began to use elephants for military purposes. Sometimes, for execution, the convict was placed on the ground and the animal was ordered to stand on the head/body of the victim. Another way they crush was to put a heavy stone on the victim's cage, which resulted in suffocation and death.